Words matter. The food industry knows that. You see, a few years ago, companies that make prunes decided to change the name of their product from prunes to dried plums. And the reason they did that was they figured that the word prune has too many negative connotations associated with it. After all, if someone goes up to you and calls you an old prune, you know that's not a compliment. And who wants to have the cashier at Giant Eagle scream into their microphone, "Hey, Wally, I need a price check on prunes at checkout aisle number 3. Because if that were to happen, the people behind you in line would stare at you and figure that you probably have some problem with your plumbing. But if instead the cashier asks, "Are those your dried plums?" then with a smile you can say, "Why, yes, yes they are." And the people behind you in line will look at you with respect and admiration. Because dried plums sounds hip. Dried plums sound trendy. Words matter. That's why the ending to the Gospel of Mark comes as such a surprise. As the Gospel of Mark tells the story, early that Easter morning, the women went to the tomb. They found that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And an angel instructed them to go and tell the disciples the good news. But what did those women do? The final verse of the gospel says, "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." In the Gospel of Mark, the Easter story ends with silence. In the Gospel of Mark, the Easter story ends with the speaking of no words. Ever since the Gospel of Mark was first written, that ending has always caused people to feel kind of edgy and nervous. And so, if you look in the Pew Bibles or in other versions of the Bible, you'll find footnotes that refer to additional longer endings that describe how the women and the disciples eventually did go and tell. How the women and disciples eventually did go and speak about the good news of Jesus. But the clear consensus among Bible scholars is that those additional longer endings were not a part of the original Gospel of Mark. Instead, those additional longer endings were not added until at least 100 years later. And so the original ending of the Gospel of Mark is where we finish our reading today at verse 8, where it says, "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And so we're left to wonder, after seeing the empty tomb, why did those women say nothing? After talking with an angel, why did those women not find any words to speak? One possibility, perhaps, is that those women were afraid that no one would believe their story. For instance, several years ago, a fishing boat crew had to be rescued from the Sea of Japan. But when the authorities questioned the crew about why their boat had sunk, the authorities immediately threw the crew into jail because they did not believe their story. That's because the fishing boat crew said that a cow had fallen out of the sky, had hit their boat dead center, shattering the hull, and caused the boat to sink within a matter of minutes. Well, of course, the Japanese authorities were not about to believe that story, and so they threw the crew in jail, assuming that they must have been operating the boat under the influence of drugs or alcohol to come up with a story like that. And that crew remained in jail for several weeks, until one day, when the Russian Air Force contacted the Japanese authorities, who told them that recently the crew of one of their cargo planes had stolen a cow that had wandered onto the edge of a Siberian airstrip. And the Russians then proceeded to force the cow into the cargo bay of their plane and took off, figuring that they would be set with beef for quite some time. But it seems that the crew was not prepared for how angry that cow was going to get and how it began to thrash around inside the plane. And so eventually, at 30,000 feet, the crew pushed the cow out of the plane as they were flying over the Sea of Japan and apparently right over that fishing boat. Maybe it was the same thing with those women on Easter morning. Maybe they were afraid that even if they did speak the truth about what they had seen and heard, that no one was going to believe them. I wonder if those women chose to remain silent and spoke no words because of a different kind of fear. I wonder if those women chose to be silent and spoke no words out of a fear that there was no use, out of a fear that even if they did speak, that their words wouldn't accomplish anything, that their words wouldn't change anything. I wonder if those women chose to be silent and spoke no words out of a fear that there's so much evil and sadness in the world that even if Jesus was raised from the dead, did it really matter? Back when the Pilgrims first came to this land in the 1600s, in their opinion, when someone died, the best thing to do was to say nothing. And so back then, when someone passed away, as quickly as possible, the Pilgrims buried the body without any funeral ceremony, without any prayers, without anyone saying a word.